Thank you, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you. I was told that there are a lot of moving pieces and I'm going to stick to the script, y'all. If there's a way to let me know whether or not we're ready and if everyone who is here slated to speak has arrived, that would be extremely helpful.
Hi, Madam Chair, Carrie here. We are ready to start when you are.
Great, thank you. So here we go. I'm going to ask everyone to put themselves on mute. I'm gabbling us in with a VIX. I'm calling this hearing to an order. For the record, my name is Julia Mejia, City Councilor at Large. I am the chair of Boston City Council's Committee on Civil Rights. I am joined by the sponsors of this docket, Councilor Flynn of District 2, Councilor Campbell of District 4, and Councilor Edwards of District 1. We'll recognize my colleagues in order of arrival. We're also joined by Councilor at Large, Councilor Wu. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 executive order modifying certain requirements of the open meeting laws and revealing public bodies of certain requirements, including the requirement that public bodies conduct its meeting in a public place that is open and physically accessible to the public, the City Council will be conducting this hearing virtually via Zoom. This enables the City Council to carry out its responsibility while adhering to public health accommodations and ensuring public access to its deliberations through adequate alternative means. This public hearing is being recorded. It is being live streamed at boston.gov/citycouncil-tv and broadcasted on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and Files Channel 964. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.civilrights@boston.gov and will be made part of the record and available to all councilors. Today's hearing is on docket 0165, order for a hearing to discuss ways for the city to prevent and investigate incidents of hate crimes and discrimination. The following individuals from the administration will be participating at today's hearing. Deputy Superintendent James Chin from the Bureau of Community Engagement, Sergeant Detective Robert Kiersgaard from the Civil Rights Unit, Avandro Cavarro, Executive Director of Human Rights Commission. Also available for questions are Superintendent Paul Donovan, Chief of Bureau of Investigative Services, Detective Joseph Tess from the Civil Rights Unit. We are also joined by advocates, including Lisette Lee, the Executive Director of Be It Aid, Bethany Lee, Asian Outreach Unit, Greater Boston Legal Services, Suzanne Lee, President, UMERT Chinese Progressive Association. We are also joined by Abigail Taylor, Chief of Civil Rights Division for the Office of Attorney General Mara Haley. What a lineup. I will now recognize my colleagues for opening statements, starting with the sponsors before moving to councilors in order of arrival. Councilor Flynn, you now have the floor.
And thank you, Councilor Mejia, for chairing this hearing, and to Councilors Campbell and Edwards for their partnership as well. And Councilor Wu has done a lot of work in this field as well. I want to thank the Boston Police and the City of Boston officials that are here with us, and the community activists I see throughout the Asian community that I work with almost on a daily basis. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit about over a year ago, we held the first meeting, I think, in the country at the Josiah Quincy School. That was in January 30th, 2020. We had Dr. Lowe, we had Marty Martinez was with us. There was a young woman, a student at Boston Latin, who spoke at the meeting and said when she would get on the bus, because of this was the start of the pandemic, she was an Asian teenager. All the white people on the train would get off the train. They associated her with the coronavirus. And that was one of the most disappointing things I ever heard on the council. But since then, I resolved that, about the last thing we could ever do is blame a certain group for this pandemic. So we tried to continue to work with the residents and with the Asian community especially, to make sure that they are treated with respect, they are treated with dignity, and there are city services available here to help them, including the police, including the Human Rights Commission, that I think could play a critical role in investigating hate crimes, discrimination, bullying, making sure that our Asian brothers and sisters are treated fairly. I'll just tell one quick story of the opportunity to serve 25 years in the US Navy in various locations. In my time in service, I served with many Asians, many immigrants, and here they are willing to put their life on their line for our country. And at the same time, the Asian men and women would come back to the United States and be bullied and be beat up or intimidated, treated with very disrespect. So that's one story I want to highlight. And the second story I want to highlight is this country has a long history of discrimination towards the Asian community. After the Asian community after the Chinese community built the transcontinental railroad, the U.S. enacted immigration policies that would outlaw the Chinese from coming into the United States. So this anti-Asian bigotry has always been in this country. It's more prevalent and prominent today. But as a city, as a country, I don't think we're doing enough to address this issue. I think the Human Rights Commission can play a critical role in working with the Boston Police in investigating crimes, prosecuting crimes, working with the police, working with the Attorney General. But I think this is a top priority, and it needs the attention and the resources, because it's a critical issue facing our residents of our city, especially those in the Asian community. Having said that, thank you again to the panelists for being here, the co-sponsors, and the city officials. Thank you, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Campbell, you now have the floor.
Okay, that's better. Technical difficulties. Hi, everyone. First of all, good afternoon to each and every one of you. And I, of course, want to first thank my co-sponsors, Councilor Flynn and Councilor Edwards, not only for your partnership, but your continued leadership. I also want to thank you, Councilor Mejia, as well, for chairing this hearing and making sure that we got a date on the books relatively quickly. Thank you to the panelists, especially our leaders and organizers in the Asian community. Really grateful for the work you continue to do in partnership and in coalition building with other communities of color. So really excited for this conversation and what we can learn as city leaders, where we can do better, of course, and where we can continue to improve existing things that are working. This conversation, as we all know, is sadly timely, but critically important after the recent murders in Georgia of several folks, including 6 Asian women, as well as the beginning of the trial of the Minneapolis police officer responsible for killing George Floyd. I can't think of a more appropriate time for us to be asking the tough questions around what we can do here in the city of Boston to make sure that all of our community residents are protected and feel safe in this city. The threats, violence, and murders of unarmed Black men and women, and the growing violence and continued violence against our Asian American residents in both the US and our own city, of course, must be addressed. These growing attacks will not go away on their own. We must do everything we can to create a city that is free of hate and harm, and frankly, do the really hard work of addressing racism and a painful history we often don't want to talk about that create these incidences and perpetuate inequities in communities of color. It's incumbent upon all of us to also raise awareness of the fact that hate crimes continue to exist in this country and in this city. I know post the Georgia incidents, there were a lot of folks in the city of Boston who were shocked to learn about the increasing attacks against our Asian brothers and sisters in the city of Boston. And I was really grateful to the leadership of many in my own district that I currently represent, which is District 4, for the work they have continued to do to push the city to have focus on these issues, and of course, to make sure that everyone is aware of the work that there's still left to do. We know too well that our communities, especially communities of color, are being targeted for hateful rhetoric, hateful actions, violence, discrimination at every level. So I think there are more things that we could be doing as a city. Grateful for all of the panelists from the various departments represented today at the hearing. Looking forward to thinking critically and thoughtfully with my co-sponsors on where we can do better. And excited for this work. And I said at a hearing just yesterday, it had to do with COVID-19 and vaccinations. Really appreciate the leadership of folks who are intentional in bringing together communities of color. And for me, that is Black, Brown, and our Asian brothers and sisters, and not continuing to work in silos. Because sadly, we know that there are some inequities in the city of Boston that are far worse in the Asian community, including within the education context, that often doesn't get lifted up. So excited for this conversation. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to my co-sponsors. And thank you, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell. Really do appreciate your remarks. I'm going to move over now to Councillor Edwards. You now have the floor.
Thank you. Again, I echo my colleagues' thanks to my co-lead sponsors on this, and also to you, Chairwoman Mejia, for hosting this important conversation. I think it's important that we also ground this in what exactly we're talking about when we say, what is a hate crime? And why are we specifically focused on those kinds of crimes? Of course, people are injured, people die, and people are caused pain by all criminal activity. And certainly if it results in death. But why specifically do we need to talk about hate crimes? And it's because, for me at least, it's not that the hate crime, it's more than the individual that becomes a victim in a hate crime. When someone targets a particular individual because of their group, of who they are, whether it's because they're gay or lesbian, because of their religion, because of their race, because of their accent, because of where they're from, it is a target towards the group. The injury is meant to go towards the entire group of those individuals. You are not welcome here. You are not as good as me. You shouldn't be able to buy this home, and so on and so forth. And that is why it's so important that we have a collective conversation then when we talk about hate crimes, that they are different. And how we investigate them, they are different, and how we make sure the community feels comfortable to come to our authorities, and that we create really inclusive pipelines for that to happen. They are different in noticing the patterns when they are happening, so that we don't take them as individuals. We see that there is a targeting towards a particular group or not. And then also they are extremely different in how we heal as a community. So it's three parts that we need to look at with all crimes, but specifically with hate crimes, how people can come forward and feel included and valued by our local law enforcement, how local law enforcement and the community in general looks at and sees patterns that are emerging, upticks that are happening, and who is being targeted, and finally, how we're going to heal as a city to make sure that they don't happen again. And I have to say, I've been on the side of having to represent immigrants, and one who was a victim of a hate crime. And when I first started actually in law at a law firm, in one of my pro bono cases working with Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, was a young Asian man who was chased down by 4 white men from, unfortunately, South Boston, chased down, head slammed into the concrete, and abused simply because of who he was. Now, they assumed that he was not from here. He was technically not from Boston, but he was actually from St. Louis, and he was targeted. And I got to see all aspects of this. The failure, in part, for he felt valued by local law enforcement. Then the investigation that happened did result actually in finding those men. So I will say that, but I will say the one part where I felt that he particularly was dismissed is in the healing, when we finally got to sit down. And this is a rare moment, sit down, look at each one of those individuals eye to eye, face to face, all at the same table for mediation. At which point the judge just basically said, well, how much money do you want? And then just end this. And it was sad. You can't compensate someone for that kind of injury in violation of their humanity. And you can't really actually help a community heal either with just dollars thrown at a place. So I want to thank also all the coalition members who are here, the original fighters, the ones who have been in the trenches for generations. When you have someone like Suzanne Lee, and then now you have Bethany, and you see the generational knowledge, the generational organization, the generational heart and commitment to making this city truly one for all. And so I'm proud to be here today. I may have to step out for a little bit, but I will be back. And I looking forward to all three aspects of this, how people can have access to law enforcement, how it is investigated, and finally how we heal. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, for that. I see that we've been joined by additional colleagues, which means I'm going to keep your remarks very brief. So if you don't mind, we're going to do an order of arrival. We're going to start off with Councilor Wu, then move on to at-large Councilor Asabi George, followed by at-large Councilor Michael Flaherty, then District 9 Councilor Liz Breeden, and with District 8 Councilor Kenzie Bach. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to please keep your remarks very brief so that we can dive into the work. Thank you. Councilor Wu, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to thank the sponsors for ensuring that the council is continuing to move forward and convene public dialogue and keep this in the public eye. I wanted to give a shout out to, I know there are many organizations represented here, but just to really lift up the efforts of the API's CAN Coalition and the Asian American Commission in recent weeks has been just foundational for ensuring that the community is speaking out and has a space and is building the infrastructure in solidarity with other communities as well. I personally support efforts to ensure that we are not focusing entirely on trying to catch things after they've gone wrong in our community, but to do the work on the front end, to invest in equity upfront, to invest in community stabilization, data equity, language access, really ensuring that we're creating the spaces for everyone to be seen and heard and valued, and to build that intersectional community and attention ahead of time. I think so many of the incidences that we have seen have been very intersectional, whether it is seniors in our community or women or workers who are routinely being exploited, long before the pandemic. And so just to think about the ways in which we are putting resources ahead of time into all of those intersections, and eager to be part of this conversation. I'm sorry I won't be able to stay for the whole thing today in this Zoom, but I will make sure to watch everything, and just want to thank you so much, everyone, for convening and for your leadership.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. Councilor Asabi George, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both the lead sponsors and the panelists and those that will offer testimony today. I look forward to today's hearing and the conversation, and certainly the work that we need to do in a better way and perhaps a different way to make sure that our residents across our city of Boston and our visitors to our city always feel welcome, always feel seen, and when there are opportunities that we don't prevent any discrimination or violence or bullying, if it's happening in our school communities or a place like that, that we are quickly responsive to the needs, again, of our residents and our tourists, our visitors to this great city. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Asabi George. Councilor Flaherty, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia, for hosting, and thank you to Councilors Flynn, Campbell, and Edwards for sponsoring the rise in hate crimes against our Asian American and Pacific Islander immigrants and other vulnerable communities is absolutely unacceptable in Boston. I'm looking forward to hearing about the role our Human Rights Commission can play in monitoring, investigating, and proceeding and providing the necessary resources and education about this issue. So look forward to the hearing, and will help any way that I can to put a stop to this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. Councilor Breeden, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you for hosting this hearing, and also to the lead sponsors, Councillor Flynn, Campbell, and Edwards. This is a hugely timely and very, very important conversation. I also want to thank all the panelists who are here to to be part of the discussion this afternoon. Let's find ways to really address hate crimes in our city, and see if we can just get to a place where folks are seen as human beings and recognized as precious human beings, and treated with respect and dignity, and not face daily abuse and physical violence. It is totally unacceptable in the city of Boston, and we hope that we can change that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Braden. Councilor Bach, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the sponsors. I just really, I want to echo what everyone said and underscore that, to Councilor Wu's point about how do we stop this before it happens. I think a lot of that is about creating an environment in our city where our Asian American community feels empowered, feels like they have a voice, feels like they're heard, they have access to the levers of government. So I hope that as we think about kind of how do you create an atmosphere that makes it harder for these things to happen, we think about, how do we end economic exploitation of low wage workers, Asian American workers? How do we, improve language access? One of the things we're talking about in other avenues, sort of, and how do we continue to really highlight the leadership and power that we see from our Asian American community? Many of the people who represent that, for me, as Councilor Edwards said, are here in the room today, whether it's Suzanne or Bethany or Carolyn or Councilor Wu, our colleague. I think that, so much of this is about showing and meaning that our Asian American members are full members of our community and are people with power and a voice. And so I think that when that's felt, I think that the people who are kind of approaching this community with hate and discrimination and think that they can get away with abuses of power sort of retreat back into the shadows. And I think that's really the kind of environment we have to create here in the city of Boston. So any way we can be helpful in that, I think we should do. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilor Bach. I do have a brief remarks, so I'll keep them very brief. For those who know, I always tend to lean into my own lived experience. So this is really personal to me. I grew up on a block that was mixed between immigrants and old school Boston families that went back generations who were not happy about the fact that we even existed. And you always would feel the tension every time you stepped outside. There was one occasion in particular that I continue to replay in my head is when one of my neighbors sicked his German Shepherd at me and knocked me off the bike. And my mom at the time was undocumented and was afraid to take me to the hospital and didn't know really what to do. But it was that moment that really helped me understand what hate looks like here in this country, and really set the path, I guess, for me to continue to lean into these conversations. So I believe the state of hate here is something that I think not only do we need to address, but it's pain, as Councilor Edwards talked about in her remarks, that we haven't even begun to process. And so as we think about the work, as we think about the trauma that we carry, I believe that we have an incredible job here to do today to create a safe space for community, to use their voice for those who have often felt like they don't have one. And I hope that we can have a productive conversation and that we leave this space here today with some ideas on how to make our city safer and kinder for everyone. So diving right into this conversation, leading the panel, we'd like to start off with our advocates before turning it over to the administration. And we'll start with Suzanne Lee, then Bethany Lee, and then finally, Lisette Lee. So I would love to ask Suzanne to please unmute if you are, and you now have the floor.
You have to start with the oldest, don't you?
With the wisest. So let's stop it with that.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and I am glad to be here to discuss this really, really important issue. And I really appreciate all the comments that I heard from other counselors is really putting a new tone and for our city. Let me share a little bit about my own background with you to underscore what I have to say. I remember at 7 years old, I heard my grandfather said, at the time I was in Hong Kong, I was the only member of our families living in Hong Kong. And he was in Hong Kong, and he said, you know, I've been in Boston a long, long time, but I only know 3 streets. Beach Street, Washington Street, and Harrison Ave. At that time, I did not understand what he meant. But much later, it was because when he said that if you leave that area, you don't know if you're going to come back alive. Now, he retired and went back to Hong Kong and China in the 30s. So my uncle, my father's older brother, came here to continue to work. And he was only in his 20s. He was shot and killed in East Boston. That was in the early 30s. And when my father came in the late 30s, and I eventually came to join the family in the early 60s. And I remember being embarrassed by my father that when he go to Chinatown, he would be talking really loud. And we lived on Blue Hill Ave at that time. And I was so embarrassed by him. I would shank his coats and I said, stop doing this. It's your embarrassment is so loud. He got really angry at me. And he turned around, he said, if I cannot talk loud in Chinatown, where else can I do that? All of that came back to me much later as a college student when I came back to the community, to serve the community, to understand what that meant. All that. But Chinatown's been home to generations of working immigrants. And yet here we are fighting to hold on. Sorry for being emotional. So when you talk about anti-Asian violence, we talk about generations. It is not new. So when my generation came along without college education, finally, came back, not only to serve the community, but to organize, that we are not gonna allow Chinatown to be swept away. They already taken half of Chinatown to build the expressway and the mass turnpike and allow institution expansion and took the other third. So what we have left is about the third the size we used to be, with more people wanting to live here because they need to. And it's the only place where immigrant working class families feel safer, not safe, safer, because there will be institutions and organizations that they can go to for help. That Chinatown is the economic, the social, and political center for all Asian people around the greater Boston area. In 2021, we are still fighting whether or not Chinatown can remain in its place to serve ongoingly, to serve working class family. We sounded the alarm 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, when the downtown boom happened, rent increase drove out so many working class families. At that time, we raised the alarm throughout the city. This cannot be, that working class family cannot stay in the city. It's not until recently that we're strong enough to build coalitions for right to the city. Who can live in this city? if not for working people who build it, to continue to build it and provide that service. And now under the pandemic, 80% of the Chinatown businesses are underwater. There are 80% less business coming in. So I don't know how long we can hang on. Over the years, we have fought to increase affordable housing with the help of legal service, fighting against eviction. But now the small business are on the verge of disappearing. And without that, there will not be a Chinatown. So when we can talk about hate crime, that's the #1 hate in my view. That workers cannot get jobs that can make a living, that families cannot stay in their home. You cannot have any more violence than that. And that's not being done to us by just people, random people in the street. A lot of it is caused by policy that allow institution expansion, that are caused by policy that allow rents to increase fivefold. We have folks that pay 50% of their income for rent. Beacon Hill and Bay Village have zoning protection to maintain their character. 3 times this happened and Chinatown was excluded. So all our row houses are dwindling. So we are fighting as hard as we can to make sure those remaining row houses we can keep them to serve working class families. So we can talk about hate crime on the street, individual hate crimes. I don't even know how you report that, because most immigrants don't know who, they're not gonna call them. He said, what do you mean if somebody spat on me? This happened last week. If somebody pushed me, do we report that to the police? What they can do about it? Mm-hmm. So really appreciated what Lydia Edwards, that we need to talk more about how reporting can happen and what kind of data we are collecting. But to me, the #1 hate crime that's being done to the Asian people is whether or not we can remain in the city. Thank you for taking so much time.
Thank you. And you know that the grace of wisdom comes in your favor, Suzanne. And I really do appreciate the way you helped us understand that hate crimes, there's so many crimes being committed. And that needs to be a part of the conversation as well. So thank you. I wanted to just be super mindful of the other panelists that will follow, that we gave Suzanne Lee an additional 2 to 3 minutes, just because she is the wisdom in the room. And I'm gonna ask Bethany and Lisette to really keep your comments to 5 minutes. And I do have Jacob on my team sending me little notes here when your time is up. So hopefully you can keep your comments within 5 minutes.
I didn't know that I had a time limit, sorry.
Oh no, that's okay. We didn't want to tell you that because we needed you to be your full authentic self up in here, but everybody else 5 minutes, okay?
And Suzanne's right, make her go last next time. How am I supposed to follow that?
That's right. Now we're disrupting the whole way we do business up in here. So we're going to go next to Bethany. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity for sharing today. And I'm the director of the Asian Outreach Unit at Greater Boston Legal Service, where we provide legal representation and support to low-income Asian Americans and immigrants in Massachusetts. And we closely partner with the community groups that you see here today to directly respond to all of the crises that affect the Asian American community. Our work with the low-income Asian American community every day demonstrates the vulnerability that our community faces. And during the pandemic, what that has meant is that low-wage workers continue to be on the front lines as the number of hate crimes increase. After the Atlanta shootings, there's been a lot of discussion about what it means to ensure justice. And more often than not, there's talk about law enforcement at that table and at the forefront of that conversation. So just given our experiences in legal services, I want to highlight some of the stories that our clients have told us in trying to call the police and reporting crimes and thinking about what that means, because language barriers or immigration status have been huge obstacles in those interactions. And these are just, I'm going to share just a few examples from the past few months. One is that a tenant called the police when her landlord pushed her down the stairs, and she was the one who ended up being arrested. In another instance, a neighbor stabbed the neighbor's wife and daughter, but after the wife and daughter got to the hospital, it was actually the husband who ended up being arrested. In a call that just came in last week, we found out that a woman called 911 for help with an injury, thinking that an ambulance would be sent because she was told that 911 can be helpful. But instead, what happened was her husband, who has a green card, was arrested, and the police report was filed without any interpreter present. So the husband now faces possible deportation. And then most recently, and maybe most relevant to today's hearing too, is that a man recently told us that he encountered a hate incident last year, but because he's undocumented, he was scared about what calling the police would mean. And so these stories are so typical in what we hear from people that call us day after day, week after week. And so I think it's really important that as we consider how to make our neighborhoods safer, we also need to confront the fears and very real consequences for the Asian community in interacting with law enforcement. And this is true for all communities of color. So I would urge the City Council to work closely with the types of community groups that you see here represented on this panel today to craft solutions, because these are the organizations that understand what getting at the root of violence means. It means investing in housing, investing in employment, schools, mental health, and so many of the other core areas that Suzanne touched upon and that we see, that our clients dealing with day to day as they go about their everyday lives. And because language access with city agencies often continues to be such a huge barrier, community groups are the ones that fill this void, despite community groups, kind of descriptions as CDCs or community organizers or the particular issue area that they're working in. Actually, the community groups end up filling in and doing a lot of the services that are necessary because language barriers and cultural barriers and so many barriers that otherwise prevent our communities from accessing the services that are available in the city don't end up being available. And having a language line isn't a substitute for a person who can speak your language and understand your situation, especially in a moment of crisis. And it's community organizations that are critical in bridging this gap. So any discussion and any new investment of rerouting of resources, when we're talking about this increase or this really this phenomenon that has been longstanding and hate violence in our communities, to me means that immediate emergency response or long-term solutions really have to deeply engage the Asian American community groups that are already in neighborhoods.
Oh, wow, Bethany. That was good job. 45 seconds under. Caught me with my sugar pops. So thank you for keeping it so concise. I think one of the things that I'm going to move on to Lisette Lee, but I really do appreciate you bringing in information justice and language justice to this conversation, because oftentimes that gets lost in these conversations in terms of being able to access information. One of the things that we've been fighting for, and to the work that we've been doing collaboratively with a lot of the groups, is also thinking about that information justice is also understanding that not everybody knows how to read and write, even in their native language. So really utilizing symbols and other ways to be able to disseminate information is important. So thank you for bringing language access into this conversation. I'm going to now move on to Lisette Lee. You now have the floor.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share testimony. Today, I am the Executive Director at the Vietnamese American Initiative for Development. We are located in the Phil's Corner neighborhood, where the Vietnamese community has built our physical and as well as our cultural and heart home in the Boston area. much of what I was going to say, Suzanne and Bethany have already articulated. So I think the two things I wanted to add is that I think there should be really investment in culture shifts, right? I think we have talked about the relationship between law enforcement and community, but I would really urge the conversation around what does it mean for people to feel comfortable, right? We had a town hall last Thursday, and one of the stories that people shared was that there was a bilingual, she speaks English, and so this wasn't a language access thing, but she had a hate incident happen, and when she called law enforcement, she didn't feel like anyone was hearing her or believing her. And so I think that needs to also be a conversation about how do we shift the culture of when these incidents happen, that people do not feel like, and so often domestic violence victims will also say, I don't want to call because the experience that I get is very similar to the experience that I experience at home. And so I just wanted to kind of keep that in mind as this conversation unravels. I think earlier someone had mentioned bullying, right? And so for as an Asian American who grew up in the United States and also hearing some of the experiences of our young people, bullying and microaggression is something that they experience in school. And so I think to really think through, what does ethnic studies look like? What does social emotional learning look like within our curriculum, so that our young people's experiences are supported, as well as their mental health is supported, that there is not enough mental health work that's happening within our school district, and especially for Asian American young people, their experience is not reflected when they are seeking support from their educators, as well as the mental health. And that mental health after incidences like this is also something that we grapple with as a community. So really push for the city to invest in bilingual and bicultural mental health, whether or not that's within organizations like ours, or embedded in institutions like public schools, public health facilities.
Thank you, Lisette. Thank you so very much for bringing all of that into the space. I would love to ask my colleagues for questions, and we are going to ask that you do keep the Q&A portion to 5 minutes. I know that might be challenging, but I know that we can do it. So that means that those who are answering the questions also be super mindful of just short and clear and concise, so that we can make sure that we can get through as many questions as possible, because we have a lot of counselors here, and I know they're all eager to participate. And the conversation doesn't have to end here. This is a hearing order. My hope is that we'll continue this outside of this space as well. So I'm going to move on now to Counselor Flynn, one of the lead sponsors. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Council Mejia. And Council Mejia, Melissa from my team, Melissa Lowe, is also providing translation service. So if there's anyone in the public that needs to be led into that particular room or wants to testify, maybe they can raise their hand and we could track it down that way.
Thank you so much, Councilor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Council Mejia. And just wanted to follow up on some of the comments my colleagues made, but just want to thank the panelists, especially Suzanne and Bethany and Lizette, for their testimony, but more importantly, their work on this issue for so many years and advocating for all immigrants and all people of color. And I appreciate the incredible work that you've been doing. One aspect that I was hoping to focus on is what role the Human Rights Commission in the city of Boston would play as it investigates hate crimes, but also the public education campaign it can play as well in educating the public about hate crimes, about bullying, intimidation, and getting this message into the schools, and working obviously with the police department. So just wanted to maybe ask one of the panelists if they've had any experience with any public awareness campaigns on talking about hate crime issues, and how can we better effectively get our message to residents across the city about discrimination, about bullying, intimidation, but also reaching our young people as well. And maybe I'll start with Suzanne.
I don't ever recall any campaign to throughout the city about harassment or discrimination. I don't ever recall having seen that. But when we talk about harassment, do we label that as a hate crime? I don't know. Because the way I understand the law, the definition of hate crime is so limited or is so narrow. What constitutes a hate crime? Do you have to be bleeding? Beaten to a pulp before it was called a hate crime? So that, I think that needs some discussion. And I think you asked a good questions from the Human Rights Commission. How do we define any of that? So before we even ask people to report it, if it's not a crime, where are we going to report it?
No, that's a good point, Suzanne. And I know Superintendent Donovan is here. I think it would be a combination of the public awareness education campaign, and then on Superintendent Donovan's side, what exactly is a hate crime, and what is the reporting on a hate crime, and what is your experience, Superintendent, on hate crimes in our city, generally speaking? Superintendent, I think you're on mute.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about that. So as far as hate crimes, it depends upon, the circumstances of it. So if, in order to be classified as a hate crime, there has to be some type of bias has to be shown towards the victim or a group. If there's if a person of Asian descent, the victim of battery, hateful speech, where no crime has occurred, there's no assault, there's no threat, there's no property damage, but yet, there was some slur used against them, that may in fact just constitute free speech, where again, the speech is hateful, but yet the speech alone does not constitute a crime. So that's when, when the police receive a report of this, or we become aware of it, then they have to, the Civil Rights Unit of the Boston Police Department will then investigate two things. One, did a crime occur? Two, is any bias present? And then they proceed accordingly on that. If there's a crime and bias, the Civil Rights Unit will retain that investigation and conduct that investigation. If there is a crime but no bias, that incident will be returned to the local district, who will then conduct a criminal investigation. If there is is biased but no crime, then they evaluate, how to, deal with that particular situation. And it's all, dependent upon the situation.
Yes. Also, to answer Councilor Flynn's question earlier, I mean, I think we're talking about a variety of things, right? Like when we're not necessarily just talking about, when we're talking about what it means to create an environment that allows for students to talk about harassment and to understand where that's coming from, and to, think more comprehensively about it, right? We're not just talking about educating about hate crimes or hate incidents. We're talking about the history of people of color in the United States. And we're talking about how that is incorporated in K-12 schools. We're talking about creating environments that allow for that type, for students to feel safer and to feel like they can speak up about incidents. That doesn't just come from saying, don't bully, don't harass. It comes from a much more holistic understanding and systemic change in schools and throughout the city, right? And even just like a small thing. This is not in schools, but one of our community partners that we all work, Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, has been talking about working with artists in creating, these kind of public education in the subway, murals and campaigns that are aimed at this, that has been happening in New York City already, right? And so there's places that we can also learn from when we talk about making safer neighborhoods. Oakland City Council has been talking about what it might mean to fund a community ambassador program so that there are people on the streets that community members already know and are familiar with and can begin to trust, right? In collaboration with community organizations, so that people feel safe in reporting and talking about the incidents that are occurring, not all of which are, rise to the level of a crime, but are still, devastating, debilitating, harassing nonetheless. And so these are all the types of things that we need to be talking about, in collaboration with all the community groups here, because it's not just about saying, let's have a campaign that says, don't bully, don't harass. And I think I can't emphasize the point enough. I mean, we have worked well with police on, for example, U visa issues, but on the other side, we have also encountered many people who have had great difficulty working with the police, or are afraid of working the police for all the reasons that I discussed earlier, right? And that's just something we have to address when we're talking about creating safe environments. We can't just keep saying, let's bring in the police, and not talk about what it actually means for communities of color to be interacting with the police.
Counselors, is it okay if I try to add some value in this space?
I do appreciate you, Amandro, adding some context into the space, but I do know that we are trying to keep it.
Okay.
But go ahead, just in the interest of
Yes.
sure that everybody has
So for
Hurry up.
members of the public, who do not know me, I'm Evandro Carvalho, and I am the Executive Director of the Human Rights Commission. Can you hear me well? I just want to make sure.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I think, along the line in terms of what Bethany just said, and certainly Ed Flynn, City Council Flynn, and Superintendent Donovan, I think the space that the Human Rights Commission can play, and in fact, we're starting to do some things to get in that space, including meeting with BPD, the Civil Rights Division, and some of the leaders in the Asian American community, including Bethany and many others in the space, is the education that we're talking about, right? A lot of the things that don't rise to the level of a crime, right, is where the human rights can come in, right? If someone files a complaint with BPD and that this happened, but BPD determines that it's not a crime in a sense, right? And individuals often feel, like they weren't heard because they don't know, what constitutes a crime, right? I think the Human Rights Commission, not only in terms of education and the public campaign in general, can play a role, but also in terms of, I think, City Councilor Edwards said earlier, in terms of the mediation and the healing that needs to take place in these communities. Often when they go to police, they don't feel like they're being heard. It's not being prosecuted, and unfortunately, the criminal justice system is beyond a reasonable doubt, right, in order to prosecute stuff. But the Human Rights Commission is on the civil side. So we don't deal with crimes, but we can partner with BPD, and we can partner certainly with many of the organizations that are present and others within the Asian community to try to see how we can position ourselves as a reporting measure too, right? Where folks can come on our websites and report even crimes, and we can connect them with BPD, right? If they don't feel comfortable going to BPD. And again, so obviously, again, in terms of being short, I'll stop there, but happy to just figure out a way for Human Rights Commission to sort of play a role, significant role ongoing in this space in terms of helping BPD and helping community organizations and Asian Americans in the city of Boston.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilor Flynn, I'm sorry, we're going to move on to our other colleagues. Is that okay? We're at time. Okay.
Yes, that's fine, Councilman Mejia. Thank you.
So we'd like to move on to Councilor Campbell from District 4. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia, and thank you again to the panelists. Really appreciate all of you guys' work. I know I know there's a clock ticking, so I'm going to jump right in. One thing I think is critically important is we talk about, and this was lifted up by many of you guys or ladies, the cultural shifts that are needed, right? And I do think government, frankly, can play a greater role in creating the space for that to happen, and that we don't always do that. Community-based organizations tend to do it. So who currently is doing this work? Suzanne, I know you have been, Lisette, I know we've talked all the time about, making sure as we're talking about communities of color that we're not just saying Black and brown. So I'm just curious from you guys' perspective, you too, Bethany, who's creating the space to talk about the shared issues in these communities, to have the tough conversations, although the histories may be different in how discrimination, exclusion, all of that show up, but that we're in this together. So who's creating that space? I do think it's also a space government can do better in creating. And then I have two more questions after that.
That question was for Bethany, right?
Or Bethany, Suzanne, and Lisette, it's up to either one of them.
I don't know if any governments create a space, but the communities has been trying to build coalitions to intentionally bring people together to work on issues that are common in other community. That goes a long way in having our collective voices out there, because what we're interested in is really address the systematic nature of what we are feeling. As I said before, it's not just act of individual. Individuals don't just randomly go out and attack certain people. And it's because they feel that they are allowed to, because that particular group of people are being treated, even by government, even by people in leadership. So then it's okay for everybody else to do that. So we need to create space where everybody intentionally, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of collective time, and also funding for groups to exist. Because all of us operate on shoestrings. I've been retired for 11 years and I'm working more than I ever did. I don't get paid for it, but
That's so, right.
So I'm just saying that they need to be.
I just wanted to, I do think there's a way for government, right, to invest in organizations and initiatives that are creating these spaces that are being intentional and being consistent, right? Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to name that, particularly we talk about cultural shifts and awareness, and educating the public as well. Because I know the time is ticking, or the clock is ticking. I have two other questions. One is, I absolutely agree with the comments around raising awareness and what constitutes discrimination, hate crimes, but the importance of creating systems that are separate and apart from law enforcement, and strengthening those systems that work. So obviously in the next panel, the Human Rights Commission is one of those systems that can be very impactful. And I know when we initially filed this hearing order last year, this was really looking at how we can strengthen the Human Rights Commission. But we have the Attorney General's office. We have the Commission Against Discrimination. When I was working on the state government side, that was one of my agencies, always responsible for strengthening that institution. So I'm curious, and maybe this is a question for you, Bethany, and you mentioned what's happening in Oakland and other places, but what are some of these systems that are separate and apart from law enforcement right now, where people can report incidents, right? That offer multilingual resources around not just legal, employment, immigration services. What are some of these systems that currently exist? Because these might be where we start in terms of strengthening and expanding. And then, of course, looking at where the gaps are.
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I mean, this also kind of goes back to your last question, I think. And I would say the organizations within API-SCAN, which is the statewide civic engagement organization coalition, that includes Viet Aid, Chinese Progressive Association, BCNC, ACDC, CMAA, all these different groups, right, that you saw at the table at the town hall last week. These are all groups that are have been actually responding to the crises in general, but then more specifically during the pandemic. These are the groups that the community has gone to deal with UI, unemployment insurance, with rent application, like rental assistance applications, right? And these are all things that actually city agencies, government agencies, state agencies should have handled. but the reality is that the language barriers and cultural barriers and many other barriers right on top of that mean that it's actually these agencies, these organizations that are the ones, kind of dealing with that initial interfacing. And then also as a result of additional language barriers, the ones then dealing with the, kind of getting the person through the process. And then with the additional communication, same thing, they're going back to the same community organizations. So to me, any sort of response, like when we're talking, whether we're talking about law enforcement, non-law enforcement or whatever, starts and ends with these community organizations, because that's where people go, right? And I think that's where you see things like and I think I think it'd be really awesome to just sit here and brainstorm a little bit at some point with you all about what it means to have all those community groups at the table, to be brainstorming those solutions, right? To really have that deeper conversation, because I think, I can talk about stuff like the community ambassador program in Oakland, but I have no idea how it's actually working, right? Like I'd want to know how it's actually working and how whether or not people are actually responding, whether or not the right amount of funding is actually going to, and what that actually means, right? Before I say, yeah, I want a community ambassador program here, right? But I think it takes those types of deeper conversations with all of these community groups at the table in order to craft those solutions and figure out what it means to have that, what's an effective frontline response, and then what are the long-term solutions that then make that frontline response more effective.
Thank you. Thank you, Bethany. And Councilor Campbell, I just want you to know I gave you extra time too. I scare y'all with the 5 minutes, but then I, give you extra time just so I can just let you know we'll do another round of questions. Councilor Campbell, I'd like to move on if that's okay.
Sounds good. I can follow up.
Thank you. Thank you. Really great discussion. So I'm going to move on now to Councilor Breda, and you now have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sometimes I have to recognize the incredible work that all these community organizations is doing and has been doing for decades. Maybe in terms of a model that would help is to help, support those. As Suzanne said, that she's working harder than ever and longer, but she's not getting paid for it anymore. To rely for the city and our community, our society, to rely on these community groups to do this work without support from the city and the state. I think there has to be a way to recognize the value of this work and to support it from an official perspective, from a public purse perspective, and that applies to many communities that are doing incredible work. So I also feel that in terms of the And again, that might raise all sorts of questions, but if that's the most efficient and direct way to give support to people who need support, then that should be the tool that we're using. So it's just a thought, and I'd like some people's perspective on that. Or are there other models in other parts of the country that work well?
You want me to pick someone? Counselor Braden, I'm gonna either you speak or I'll point you out. How about Suzanne Lee, or would you any models or things that you can share?
I do have a thought. I appreciate your list for bringing that up, but a lot of our organizations, the reason we do that work is because we see inequity and we push to get things changed. But the minute that we accept any kind of government, where city government or state or federal government funding, we feel like our hands are tied because it often comes with strings attached.
Yes.
So you can figure out how we can get support without that. We need to be free to call things out as we see it.
Then we need to look for another bucket of money that we can draw on to support this sort of work that doesn't have strings attached. Yes. I really feel that you are the experts. You are the experts. You know firsthand the experience. Like, I was very moved by your testimony and how your world is shrunk because of this, the racism and the hate that's out there. Yeah. To think that your grandfather knew 3 streets in a narrow area. Mm-hmm. So I really feel, yes, that's something we should explore to see, to recognize the value of the incredible work that you folks are doing, and then see if we can find a funding source that will adequately support this incredible work. The other notion that I had when we were talking about, that there's nowhere to go with the complaint is, it brings me back to thinking about restorative justice models to see if we can, have a healing circle where people can come together and be heard and be recognized. And to find some healing, because as Councillor Edwards recognized, how do you heal from this? Mm-hmm. This is a generational insult. This is a generational wound that goes on and on and on and on and on. And we have to stop, break the cycle, and start to really address, microaggressions and bullying. It starts at a very young age, and it's perpetuated through people's life cycles. And I think, we have to find some ways to be able to have a conversation with people and educate more people, so that we have bystanders who will intervene and say, no, that's not appropriate, and bystanders who will just really stand with the folk who are being abused and exposed to microaggressions, bullying, hate speech, the whole 9 yards, before it gets to physical assaults, which are even more serious. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Braden, you did that right on time, but I believe someone was going to say something, so please go right ahead. You have the floor.
I was just going to give a small example of how it has worked with community organizations. For draft applications, for example, Metro Housing Boston, we discovered was having issues being able to access and have Vietnamese and Chinese speaking people access them for the emergency rental assistance application. So what ended up happening was, instead of subcontract to Viet Aid and ACDC to do those rental applications directly in Chinese and Vietnamese, because people were already going to those organizations, right? And I think we'd have to explore what that means in all these different contexts. But that's just a small example of one of the things we all collaborated on during the pandemic in order to make sure that people within our communities have access.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you for that.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to move on. Councilor Braden, thank you so much for those insights and questions. I'm going to move on now. I believe Councilor Edwards, you are back. Are you with us?
Thank you. I did want to just mention to pick up on the part that of generational harm, and I mean, first of all, Suzanne, I heard majority of your testimony, and it actually reminded me of my own family's generational harm, and how again hate crimes and even the threat of them changed the trajectory of my family, which we were in the South for a long time. I want to say we were my mother's great grandfather. I want to say Alabama. I'll check on my mother's side. He had the gumption or wherewithal to stand up for himself and his family as a poor Black man. And as a result, he received a card that has an eye on it. It has a specific design of an eye, which means the eye of the Klan is on you. When you receive that card, you are going to be lynched and died or suffer physical violence. That night, my great grandfather to her grandfather packed up the family and they left for Cincinnati, Ohio. And that's where they ended up. And that's where my family is to this day, or my mother's side of the family is in Cincinnati, Ohio. And so again, that was, we could go, I mean, no one questions what the Klan is, what it does, and how those things, but I mean, generational to this, the total displacement of somebody and a family and history is where this comes from. So I wanted to just acknowledge that, and also just those kinds of pain points. It's important that we see those bridges, totally different backgrounds, right? Different parts of the country, same trajectory and generational harm. So picking up on the healing component, which is very important for me. And I think that's where our community groups have the best latitude, because so many of the community groups, which I've had the blessing to work in an immigrant worker center, and I'm telling you, there's something very healing, not just for myself, but for the workers who come there. And Suzanne, you could speak to this, so can Bethany. When you meet somebody where they are and they come with a problem, but leave after working with your organization as a leader, right? Mm-hmm. That's what you do. It's a healing from pain. And so that's the expertise I think I would like for you to tap into, about how, not only tap into it, but share it with our law enforcement officers, how someone can come to you in pain and leave more empowered. That is the bridge. That is that sweet spot that I feel you have perfected. Mm-hmm. And I see it. I would come as a lawyer, sometimes a CPA, and meet some of the most incredibly empowered workers who, when I first met them, and we were talking about not being paid and not getting what they deserve, and then by the time we were going to court, or by the time we were organizing, was a whole different woman. Mm-hmm. And so that is where I'd love to see that kind of help. And maybe the grant and the funding pools that we need shouldn't come for so much the enforcement, but from health and healthcare. Because we noticed with COVID, for example, we managed to get that money. We managed to raise money in a resiliency fund, and that was private dollars. And I would support giving out grants of private dollars, which I think, and you can correct me again, those who are in the community, private dollars leveraged for specific could give you the most flexibility you need. Mm-hmm. While you hold us accountable, because that's what you were talking about, Suzanne. You were like, we need the freedom to tell you you're messing up too, and get your check. I know who you're talking about. Yep. But so that sweet spot, I'd love for you to speak to that, and also speak to private dollars and growth. Anybody?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we can have support from everywhere with no strings attached, because we have demonstrated and have proven our track records, and how we use that money is like what you said, is allow people to heal and be a contributing member of a society that makes things better for everybody else. When they rise, everybody rises. And it just reminded me, I just finished a campaign recently. In fact, today I'm going to deliver the checks. It came from private funding. The story was in the Globe last week. They just contacted me. I trusted you. Here's the money. Go help small businesses. So we came up with this plan to continue the We Love Chinatown campaign, to identify small family-owned businesses that were not able to access any of the federal money because they don't have a regular bank that they do business with. If you don't have that, then you can't access any of that money. And never mind that the bureaucracy that it takes to get it. So we're printing up vouchers. For example, we give each establishment a few $1,000s, and we print that amount of vouchers and give it out to unemployed workers, and they go there and get takeouts. So it gives the businesses business, and it also help unemployed workers. Programs like that. Well, we need to have money to do that, right? I was just fortunate, and I know people, but I don't know how we can do that in a bigger scale. I think every neighborhood needs that. And Julia, you have that samples too.
Yeah.
In your neighborhood, right?
Yeah. We got ideas. Luisa
Yes.
and I go way back, so yes.
Yes. But yeah, that would be a great idea, but I don't know. Do people give out money with no strings attached?
We'll figure out a way. Or we leverage projects.
Leverage, yes. To give it to the right people, because everybody would say what they want, they would do it. But there are certain people that have the track records that have been proven.
Thank you.
Colonel Edwards, I want to be a little bit conscious of time. We are over, and wanted to know if you had any more questions for this panel.
Not so much for the panel, but for you as the chair, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to keep this in committee for subsequent working sessions and conversations while we're dealing with this moment and uptick.
Absolutely. I said earlier that this is just the beginning of the work and the conversation, and so definitely going to be keeping it in committee. And I think that the work is so much greater than just one hearing. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to move on to Councillor Bach, and then I do have some of my own questions and reflections before we move on to the administration. And I do want to be super mindful that we are trying to end by 3. I don't know if that's possible. So just for the administration, just to prepare your remarks accordingly.
Well, with that in mind, Councillor Mejia, I'll be very brief. I mean, I'm grateful for the conversation we've had already, and I think I really want to amplify Councillor Edwards's point about what your organizations do in terms of helping people step into their power and leadership, and I think that's so much of how we change this 100-year-old dynamic, right? And I think that Suzanne, you're really like one of our original models here of what that means in the city of Boston. But it shouldn't all land on your shoulders, and we need a multiplicity of people in that situation. So I guess a question I have, and it's fine if you feel like you've already answered it, just other ways that you think the city can concretely be helpful. I agree completely with the point about money and trying to have it as much as possible with the grassroots organizations that actually work with folks. But, I think about the way that I think the sort of related work that your organizations and others do, building worker power, and fighting back against wage theft and such, that's a piece of helping people know their power. When we talk about like reporting to authorities and feeling like, hey, like I can actually stand up for myself. And I don't have to accept this treatment. Like that feels to me like an analogous space where if we empower people, that's also going to help us push back against hate and discrimination. So that's and then I think it's same thing in the housing realm, right? Like I don't have to accept what my landlord is trying to do to me. I can stand up with my colleagues. So those are 2 examples of the type of work that I know that Chinatown community does that I think are kind of not just analogous, but actually help with this. But I wondered if there was anything kind of in that vein that you all feel like the council, the city government could support more strongly in ways that would help make this a harder place for hate of this kind to flourish at all.
Mhm. Well, as I said before, there are policies that create the situations that I find ourselves in right now. Those are long-standing policy, what is being allowed to do. So we need to take a hard look in all the city policy that create that and do away with it. Because that would say it goes a long way. Why is there some community, particularly poor working class neighborhoods, are being allowed to destroy and to create space for other people because they like to? All in the name of big businesses have the right to make money. I'm not saying that they can't make money, but just how much? Can they, at the expense of people, destroying people's lives and the whole community? So that's a city policy. That sends a message. Who is being valued?
Absolutely.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I think that, the question that we get asked a lot is like, what will make people feel less invisible, right? And I think part of it is that to have a life that they're comfortable in. So I think you all are going to be talking soon about increasing IDP to build more affordable housing. I think that is an area to kind of, move a conversation. There is a bill in the State House about data equity and creating disaggregated data so that communities like the working class Vietnamese community is not part of an aggregate Asian American that often gets lumped with whites when it comes to data. I think there are ways to increase BPS's budget so that there are more mental health workers. And so I think somewhat to Suzanne's point is kind of looking in each department and going into budget season and saying, how do we make the budget more equitable? And that, we'll kind of hit at some of these systemic issues that we've been talking about this afternoon.
Great.
I so appreciate, Kenzie, what you're doing with bus number 55. That's a perfect example, right? Community who really need that's going to be gone.
Yeah,
What
bus
messages
18, yeah. You'll get bus 18 and along .app as well, right? And then those are kind of like moments to push back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's been I've been thinking a lot about how so I represent a lot of Chinese speaking seniors, both in Mission Park and in the Fenway. And so who have been so missing the community of Chinatown, right? And that 55 is the way the ones from the Fenway get to Chinatown in normal times. And I've just been thinking a lot about how totally absent their voices have been from all of the MBTA's processes because of not having meetings in person and the language access and other issues. And I think we saved the Heath Street line in large part because CPA and others did organize, getting the signatures of about 200 of them in Mission Park. But that was, without community organization on that front, they were just nowhere in that conversation. And we've been having some come to our protests on the 55, and that's been really good. But I worry a lot, to Lisette's point, about how our processes make people invisible. And I do think that language access and work that Councillor Mejia and Councillor Wu and Flynn and lots of folks on the council have been doing for a while is a key piece of this. But just, yeah, really, really appreciate you guys on all these fronts.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. Is that it?
Thank you. Yes, I'm mindful of time, Councillor Mejia.
And you did a great job, Councillor Bach. Really do appreciate you modeling behavior. I just have a few remarks and just one question or two. I'm just really super mindful of time. And Jacob, you can time me as well. Thank you. So first of all, I think when we talk about generational hate and how we pass it on, I think that moment that I described in my early childhood really set the stage for how I experience every system that I interact with. And I think that oftentimes we carry that. And there is a legacy here of hate here in the city of Boston. And we can't have the conversation without recognizing that that still continues to fester. And it shows up in so many different ways. And when Suzanne talks about this whole idea of being displaced, when they tell you to go back to where you came from, they're telling you that. But then the type of development that's happening makes you may not go back to where you came from, but they actually find ways to get us out of where the places that we are trying to build our homes in. So I think that there's those go back to where you came from is very tied into the displacement conversation. And I'm so glad that you're bringing it in here in terms of a hate situation. And I also think would like to echo the fact that we ask organizations to participate, but then we set terms and conditions in terms of what that's going to look like. And that's the most disempowering thing that you could do to organizations that you're trying to build with. So I do think that we need to reevaluate and imagine what community investments look like, not even engagement, but investments. I think that we need to even change the conversation because we need to invest in organizations. And the whole idea of bureaucracy, we in our office experienced that firsthand when COVID first came, from the rental relief forms not being translated in multiple languages, to the fact that we were trying to build the Bodega Project and providing resources to people right in their own neighborhoods with culturally competent foods and access to resources. The city of Boston struggled with it because there were a lot of systems and structures put in place where they weren't able to contract or work collaboratively and pour money directly into these small businesses. So the bureaucracy gets in the way of progress. And I think it's really important for us to lean into that as well. And then my question is, in terms of just the responsiveness I'd be curious to know, because I've heard this from a lot of folks, is that when they call the Boston Police Department or when they call folks to report a crime or a hate crime, usually the people who show up on the scene are not culturally, linguistically competent, and just curious about what experiences you've heard from your constituencies in regards to just the lack of cultural competency when folks do appear on the scene to report a hate crime or any kind of crime, because I don't think a hate crime, the way it's being defined, really sees and validates the people, because what I experienced then may have not been considered a hate crime. And I think that we need to redefine what hate crimes are and validate how people experience them. So I'm just curious if anyone could speak to that.
I think Bethany has a lot of examples.
Yeah, and you're going to hear a little concert because my daughter's playing piano in the background. But I think all those examples that I listed earlier are just the few examples in the last, in the last few months, right? And it's not atypical. I would say pretty much every single situation we interact with clients on involving the police have some sort of, there is some sort of issue where they've been arrested, even when they're the ones that are calling. We've dealt with situations that we ended up being conflicted out on where both parties have been arrested, right? But they've come through the same community organization. It kind of also goes to show you the lack of resources for our community, right? Because everyone goes, both parties go to the same organization in order to get help from the same legal organization, right? And that's a consistent story. And so, I can't say how much every single person that we have dealt with in the past several months, if not, generally in the intake, we do weekly intake, in Chinatown, in Dorchester, and in Malden, now all over the phone. And every single situation that comes in is one in which someone has had a difficult and challenging interaction with the police, whether it's because of language barriers and there's no interpreter, or even when there is an interpreter there, or even when the officer can speak that language, doesn't mean that they're actually interacting with the people who have called them in a way that makes sense, right? And so I mean, I can't underscore that enough, because I think making sure that there is cultural competence and understanding of immigration issues within the current law enforcement structure, and then really trying to understand what kind of non-law enforcement options are available to people, right? And this is true in domestic violence context. This is true with people who are just injured, and this is true whether someone is undocumented or not. We see these issues across the board.
Thank you for that, Bethany, and the beautiful music in the background. Appreciate it. I'm just going to do a quick little follow-up, and anyone, even someone from the administration may kind of want to lean into this. I'd love to see some sort of accountability or dashboard where we're keeping track of these incidences, and would love to see more of a, like, what are we doing about it? Like, where's the growth mindset, and how are we repairing the harm, if you will? Evandro, I mean, at some point, you're going to be speaking, so I'd love to hear what you all are doing in the Human Rights Commission to really lean into these scenarios that Bethany has just laid out for us. And I think in terms of when we know what we know, the question always is, what are we going to do about it, right? And how that's going to change moving forward. So those are the sort of things that I'd like to dig in a little bit when it's your turn. And I'm being told that I have 30 seconds left, and I will yield the rest of my time to move on to our second panel. So thank you for our first panel. We'd love for you all to stay. I see Councilor Campbell, you just raised your hand.
Hey, I know we're being mindful of time. I just wanted to lift up one point that I think is critically important on the funding piece, because there's a real example that I think is applicable to what folks were saying around how we get the city to invest in these organizations that are best situated to do the work on the ground and in community, with investing with no strings attached. And I think the Youth Development Fund is a great example of that. That was my first budget initiative, and it came out of a hearing for a whole bunch of organizations on the ground, serving young people, preventing violence, interrupting violence, and saying, good luck, they couldn't apply to the city for resources without going through hurdles, without defining their young people as at risk, without going through this cumbersome application process. So with that fund, there's been an ease in process, an ease in application, even thoughts around how you support an initiative versus just a community organization. Sometimes an organization just needs some funding one time, not 3 years. And so I do think it's a good model for us to look at in future working sessions on how we support these type of organizations that are doing the work in communities, particularly immigrant communities, or doing the work of connecting communities of color in that coalition building and responding to issues. So I just wanted to lift that up for our future working sessions. But thank you all so very much. This was a really powerful panel, and clearly more work to do. Thank you, Councilor Mejia.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell, no worries. So I'd like to turn it over to the second panel, and if panel one would be willing to stay to listen in. I always think that dialogue is really important, because I think that oftentimes in these spaces, one panel goes and then the next, and there's really no shared communication. So if you all don't mind sticking around, it would be great. But if you can't, we totally understand it. So I'm going to move on to panel two. I'm going to start off with Director Carvalho. Oh, Cavallo, I'm changing your name. Sorry, you not have the floor.
I like the way you said it, actually. Carvalho. It's good afternoon. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure that all my technical difficulties out of the way. I'm Evandro Carvalho. As I said earlier, I am the Executive Director of the Boston Human Rights Commission. First of all, I want to thank all of you, including the counselors, the sponsors, and certainly you, Chair Mejia, for this important discussion on a matter that we all obviously care about in the city of Boston, and want to make sure that the Asian Americans in the city of Boston feel that they can come certainly to the city for help in this much needed time in which unfortunately we're seeing across the country hate crime increase against Asian Americans, and particularly what we saw in Atlanta. We don't want to be in Boston, a place where this can happen as well. So I'm happy to be here, obviously, with members of BPD Civil Rights Division unit, I should say, and happy to engage in this space as the Human Rights Commission Director. Obviously, you all know the history of the commission, so I won't do it again, particularly since we're in a tight space. But essentially, the commission is designed to be, I heard the word MCD earlier, is designed to be a mini MCAD, if you will, for the city of Boston, which means that we are intended to study and investigate discrimination issues in the city of Boston, and also to, focus on discrimination and human rights violations in the city of Boston. And obviously, in the past, we know that the commission has had some capacity issues, and that's due to the fact that the commission is new as an agency for the city. In fact, August 2019 is when I was brought in by Mayor Walsh to get the commission up and running. And at this point, we have 2 staff members that are full-time staff members, along with 7 commissioners that are appointed by the mayor, and actually very, very, very active, and it's been very helpful to us in this space. I will say, though, that in terms of capacity building, particularly in this space, as we're talking about what the commission can do more of, is the fact that we have finally approved in a sense that we can actually start hiring. And in fact, next week, if not this week, we're going to post online these positions, starting with the policy and research analyst. So this full position, again, policy and research analyst, education and outreach manager, which I think could be a position that could be very helpful in this space as we talk about potentially doing campaigns, and education campaigns in the Asian in Boston to help shift the culture of hate. Also, the other couple positions is program manager, as well as an investigator. Okay, those are the 4 positions that we are queued to hire. Happy to, in fact, have some of the organizations involved to help us get some great candidates that speak different languages. That's one of the things that we want to focus on in the commission. The other thing that we are focusing in right now and doing is upgrading we're working with the city IT department to revamp our website, in which we're going to have an official intake form posted for people that make official complaints of discrimination within the city of Boston. But we also are working on another form that folks can access through the website, again, in which victims of hate crime, victims of witnesses of hate crime, anyone within certainly the Asian American community and other communities can come in and say, go online and say, this happened, I watched it, I saw it happen, and for us to figure out a way to help those individuals. In the meantime, though, one of the things that I spoke about earlier briefly, a couple of things that we've been able to accomplish is, my camera's off. I didn't even realize that. I apologize. Someone should have told me this. I did not realize that my camera's off. So let me pause here and I'll turn my camera on. I apologize. I thought I was on camera when I was speaking this whole time. So I apologize. So kudos to Susan, my staff member, my teammate who texted me that information. So I apologize for the interruption, but I think it's necessary for people to see me speaking as well. So as I was saying, in terms of some of the things that are going on right now, particularly the issue that we're here to speak on, we've been in touch with many of the members of the BPD that are present here today and discuss some ways that, as I said earlier, the Human Rights Commission can serve as, if you will, a place that if folks are not comfortable going into BPD to report a crime, that they can come to us first, or vice versa. If BPD gets something that maybe does not rise to the level of a crime, they can contact us for us to focus primarily on some of the things that I heard some of the council speak again, which is the healing, as well as, and I heard the word, restorative justice. This is a space that the Human Rights Commission is looking to play a role in mediating issues that apparently arise in the city of Boston along the lines of hate crimes. So just to kind of summarize that, we are in touch with BPD and figuring out ways that we can be helpful in that space. And finally, as I said before, also, we have met with many Asian American community leaders and will continue to do so. Hopefully, we can find a way to connect with the city council. As I heard before, we're going to hopefully continue to have a working session in this space. And, I'm certainly available to see what the human rights can do long-term and short-term, whether it's to do our campaign to help shift the culture of hate crimes against Asian Americans in the city of Boston, or more, I guess, internally, whether it's to be in touch with BPD or other city departments to see what other city departments need to do better in order to better serve the Asian American community, including BPS, certainly immigrant advancement team. Yusuf and his team have been very, very close to us in this initiative. In fact, they led the meeting with the Asian leaders that we had literally yesterday and talked about some of the same issues that we talked about here, which is funding, which is language access for folks, right? And so on. So again, happy to be in this space, to figure out a way to make sure that we become a more equitable and inclusive city of Boston. And the Human Rights Commission is certainly getting up to speed in terms of staffing, in terms of hopefully a better website that we can be more accessible, and more importantly, actually, continue to build with many of the organizations that are present and others, so folks have a way to get in touch with us beyond just coming on the city website. If we can have folks like Bethany, certainly Suzanne and many others. Karen is another woman that participated in the meeting yesterday. So if they know that we exist, if there's something that's going on in their community, they certainly can reach out to us, and we'll find a way, whether it's to resolve it ourselves, or as BPD, or I heard the AG's office, certainly the MCAD, the Civil Rights Division of the federal government here in the city of Boston, and many other agencies and support that exists. So we're certainly here to be helpful as much as we can. So
Okay.
is that fair enough?
Oh, that is more than fair enough, and you went over your time, but thank you.
I apologize.
It's all good. No, don't worry. So there should be like a loud noise, but I don't have that system here.
Yeah, I didn't see anything, so I apologize.
No, it's all good. No, don't worry. I think it's important to allow people to speak, and so no worries. I'd like to turn over now to Deputy Superintendent James Chin. You now have the floor in 5 minutes.
Okay, good afternoon. I'll try to be brief. Just want to give a snapshot of what the police department has been doing. And obviously I want to do it in the best interest of time. So thank you, everyone. I'm Deputy Superintendent James Chin. I am the Assistant Bureau Chief for the Bureau of Community Engagement. The Boston Police Department appreciates the opportunity to participate in this important hearing regarding hate crimes and discrimination. The Boston Police Department is committed to protecting all of the communities from harm, hatred, and violation of civil rights. We work hard to proactively engage with all communities, building trust and relationships so that they will feel comfortable coming to us if they need help or have a problem. We understand that many immigrant communities bring with them bad experiences with corrupt or militarized law enforcement from their home countries. The Bureau of Community Engagement, the Civil Rights Unit, and our 11 district community service offices reach out to these communities through events, activities, programs, and community meetings. I believe education and awareness is critical. We run discussions and dialogues so residents will know their rights, how to report a crime or file a complaint, and how to contact us with quality of life concerns. We want residents to be empowered to advocate for themselves and their communities. In response to an increase in hate crimes nationally against Asians, the department has increased outreach efforts with Asian communities. We've been working with the Boston Human Rights Commission, Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement, community-based agencies, local newspapers to promote awareness and reporting. The District A1 Community Service Sergeant meets regularly with both the Chinatown Neighborhood Council and the Chinatown Neighborhood Safety Group to discuss social and criminal issues, as well as available resources, including the Civil Rights Unit. The two District C11 civilian liaisons to the Vietnamese community inform their communities of resources that are also available. At our request, the Epoch Times and the Sampan newspaper have informed their readership of the function of the Civil Rights Unit. and the manner in which to report hate incidents. Social media notifications have also been made through the Asian American Civic Association. To assist with outreach efforts, we are also in the process of translating the Civil Rights Unit brochure into traditional and simplified Chinese, as well as the 4 other major languages in the city per the Language and Communication Access Ordinance requirements. A little bit about the BPD Civil Rights Unit. They were created in 1978 and was the first specialized unit in the nation formed to specifically address hate crimes. This unit is staffed with a lieutenant detective, 2 sergeant detectives, and 5 detectives who are carefully selected and trained to investigate civil rights violations. The unit is also staffed by 2 interpreters, fluent in Chinese, Vietnamese, and Laotian. Assigned detectives are also fluent in Spanish. The purpose of the Civil Rights Unit is to reinforce the city's policy that any person, regardless of race, color, religion, disability, national origin, gender identity, or sexual orientation can be free of violence, threats, or harassment in living, working, worshiping, or traveling throughout any neighborhood in Boston. The unit monitors, reviews, and coordinates the Boston Police Department's response and investigative efforts concerning possible violations of civil rights incidents. The Civil Rights Unit closely monitors national hate incidents and trends and is cognizant of the current environment of bias towards our Asian community. The unit is dedicated to analyzing patterns of hate and bias, taking immediate and forceful action to identify persons who commit hate and bias crimes, arresting them and bringing them before the court. In conjunction with the department's district community service offices, the Civil Rights Unit collaborates with the Asian American Civic Association, Chinatown Neighborhood Council, Chinatown Safety Committee, Massachusetts Asian American Educator Association, networking organizations for Vietnamese Americans, Vietnamese American Community of Massachusetts, Vietnamese Community of Massachusetts, and the Vietnamese Dual Language Committee Group. The Boston Police Department's coordinated outreach and response is critical, but we need residents to come forward and report hate crimes. All communities need to know that allegations of hate crimes are taken very seriously by the Boston Police Department. We appreciate any assistance the council and all of our partners on panels to provide with these outreach efforts. So quickly, I would like to have Sergeant Detective Robert Kiersgaard from the Civil Rights Unit just share some data and information related to the hate crimes in Boston, specifically anti-Asian incidents. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon. I am Sergeant Detective Robert Kurzgard, and I am a detective supervisor assigned to the Boston Police Department Civil Rights Unit. The Boston Police Department Civil Rights Unit appreciates the opportunity to participate in the hearing today regarding hate crimes and discrimination. I would now like to share some data and information related to hate crimes in Boston, specifically anti-Asian incidents for the calendar years of 2019, 2020, and year-to-date 2021. I want to first shed some light that the common theme here is what is a hate crime and what is a hate bias incident. Fortunately, the Civil Rights Unit has addressed this for the last several years when we do our reporting, and the numbers I'm going to go over reflect both the civil rights crimes and civil rights incidents that do not rise to the level of a criminal complaint, but we still track that. In 2019, we had 14 hate bias incidents involving Asian victims. Of those 14, 7 we classified as civil rights crimes. In 2020, we had 19 incidents, hate bias incidents involving Asian victims. Of the 19, 12 were considered civil rights crimes. And in 2021, there was an increase. We've had year-to-date 13 hate bias incidents involving Asian victims. 4 of those are classified as civil rights crimes. Another 4 are ongoing, and 5 were determined not to be hate crimes. If there's any questions, I can go over specific cases if you'd like.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for that. I am going to now see if we do have one more person that is lined up to speak. I'm going to, last but not least, I'm going to turn it over to Abigail Taylor, who's the chief of the Civil Rights Division for the Office of Attorney General Mara Healy. Chief Taylor, you now have the floor, and then we'll move on to questions.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much today just listening into this hearing, and really want to thank you, Chair Mejia, the lead sponsors, the Civil Rights Committee, all the advocates, and my other panelists on this panel. It's really been enlightening and informative. There's no doubt that hate crimes and other hate and bias motivated conduct are on the rise here in Massachusetts, as they are across the country, and the statistics that we just heard, I think, speak to that. And also that we have an opportunity with the light that's being shined on violence and hate that has been endured for years to really address this from a holistic approach, as Bethany described earlier, which I think was a great description. From anti-Asian violence, attacks against immigrants, racist graffiti and slurs, what we've seen happening in our communities, it's simply unacceptable. And it was just so appalling to hear local officials after the Atlanta massacre saying that the perpetrator had simply had a bad day. We just can't tolerate those kinds of excuses for white supremacy, for violence, for terrorism, and for hate. Instead, we all have to work together, from local communities to the city of Boston, to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to the federal government, to prevent hate, to name it when we see it, to ensure accountability, and to support victims. We do need to present and provide clear opportunities for our residents to report hate incidents, and we need to respond in an appropriate, thoughtful, and culturally responsive way. I want to take a little bit of time just to talk about how the Attorney General's office can support in this work in the city of Boston and elsewhere, and what the Civil Rights Division, what our particular role is in addressing this kind of hate. In short, our Civil Rights Division is open for business as a resource to address hate and bias. Since 2016, we've operated a hate crimes hotline so people can call if they've been harassed, threatened, intimidated, or attacked. That number is 1-800-994-3228, and we also have a complaint form online. In our division, the Civil Rights Division, we bring civil actions under the Massachusetts Civil Rights Act, which protects against hate-based threats, intimidation, or coercion. And we bring civil actions under our other civil rights laws, which protect against discrimination in housing, in public accommodations, and in employment. I want to focus on the enforcement under the Massachusetts Civil Rights Act in particular, because I think it can be an effective tool for serious civil rights violations that don't rise to the level of a criminal offense, or where a complainant simply doesn't want to take a case criminal. It allows us to obtain civil injunctions against perpetrators of hate to stop them from engaging in this pernicious conduct. For example, we brought a case last spring against a Roslindale man who continuously harassed and threatened his Black neighbors using racial slurs and other racially charged language, which caused these neighbors to be afraid to leave their house and afraid to even let their children play in their own yard. After a lawsuit by my division, the neighbor agreed to stop his racist behavior and is now permanently enjoined from communicating in any way with his neighbors. As another example, from just a few weeks ago, we brought a case against a Lynn landlord who had repeatedly threatened to call ICE against his tenants when they complained about unsanitary conditions in their apartments. Instead of being able to enjoy their homes, these tenants lived in fear of their landlord and of the immigration authorities who he said he would call. Back in October, after one altercation between the tenants and the landlord, this worst fear was realized. ICE came to the apartment, to this man's home, and arrested him, and he was detained for several hours before he was released. People just shouldn't live in this kind of fear. We also need better tools, I think, on the criminal side as well. And that's why we've been working to clarify our hate crimes laws. Right now, we have 2 laws in the books. They're not really used that often, to be honest. They're confusing, they're unclear, and we don't think they're targeted appropriately to combat hate. Our new proposal, which is a bill co-sponsored by Representative Trom Wynn and Senator Adam Hines, would restructure the statutes into one law that better reflects their purpose of protecting those who are targeted because of race or other protected characteristics. Among other changes, our proposal would add immigration status as a particular protected class. We welcome your feedback and encourage support of our proposal. But listening to this conversation, I'm really reminded about how we need to do more than just enforcement, and enforcement's really only one piece of the puzzle. As law enforcement on the civil and the criminal side, we need to be humble about this and to recognize that, again, we need this more holistic approach. Part of this is through outreach, through education, and through prevention, and part of it is that we listen. For every case that we bring at the Attorney General's office, we have many instances in which the best thing we can do is provide support or education, or where we can get educated about issues ourselves, with people who are experiencing hate or with people who are worried about it, with communities that are particularly vulnerable. This involves establishing trusted relationships with vulnerable communities and with the kind of community groups that were discussed earlier. It involves conducting training for law enforcement, for local officials, and for community groups, and having an open line of communication with the community groups that have been discussed today. And it also involves prevention in our schools. And I'll just say lastly, last November, we put out some guidance for schools around their legal obligations to address hate and bias, and also specific resources for them and how to prevent these incidents and address them. With the return to in-person learning in Boston as across the Commonwealth, I think schools need to be really ready to address these incidents when they occur. We're really happy to be a resource in that area, as well as the others that I've discussed. And it's just so great to make the connections in this hearing with all of you. I really look forward to how we might be able to work together moving forward. Thank you so much. I may have gone over my time. I apologize for that.
It's okay. We're going to let you live a little bit longer. Everyone did, so you're all good. So I'd like to now open up the floor for my colleagues to ask their questions, and I ask our counselors to please keep their Q&A portions to no more than 5 minutes. So I'm going to go to Counselor Flynn. You now have the floor. Would love for you to use this moment to ask your questions to our panel.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia, and thank you to the panelists once again for the important work you're doing. And to Abby Taylor, I had the opportunity to work with the Chinese Progressive Association and the Attorney General's office on wage theft related issues, especially for our restaurant workers. So I want to acknowledge the work of your office in standing up for immigrant rights as well. When someone experiences a racist or discriminatory incident, obviously it can be a difficult time for that person, but also to find the right opportunity or who to contact to report the incident. The victim of a hate crime or discrimination or a racist incident might also be too fearful to come forward and report to authorities. So just having said that, just want to ask the Boston Police or Evandro, what's the best way for someone to report an incident, whether it may be a hate crime or not a hate crime, or bullying or intimidation? What's the advice you would give someone working that wants to report such an incident?
Council Paul Donovan here. I guess I'll take that. So I think most importantly would be the nature of the incident. If it was an ongoing assault, then certainly, that individual should be calling 911 and reporting that, if there's an imminent, threat or danger to themselves or anyone else, 911 is the first place to call. If it's not of an imminent nature, they can always contact. They can still call 911, or they could contact the district of occurrence. They could ask to speak to the detectives, or in a case of District 1 or District 11, if language is an issue, the community service office down there, District 1 and District 11, they can facilitate, the language barrier and get a report taken on that, and then get the investigative process moving. The biggest problem seems to be in reporting is the language and trust. It's not new on that front. It's been for quite some time. We've sought to make that easier. The Civil Rights Unit has a couple of civilian interpreters available for that very reason. They've been there for a number of years. I know they've had success, but yet still is that level of trust we've been trying to deal with. So again, 911 or contact the local station.
Thank you, Superintendent. And Evandro?
Yes, I'll add briefly on our end. With the best way I would think of situations like this would be to contact 311, right, which is very simple for folks that I'm sure folks are familiar with in most areas, that they can contact the city to 311 with any issues. And certainly through 311, they'll refer it to us, right? Particularly issues of hate crimes or discrimination in the city of Boston. 311 folks know to contact us. The other thing that I mentioned earlier was the website that hopefully we're going to make it much more user-friendly in the near future. But that's another way to contact us. And I think, obviously I can give out my cell phone as well, but I think the best way really would be through 311. And the other thing that I would suggest, particularly as we continue to build with organizations within the community that are much more trusted and sometimes have more language capabilities than us, I encourage folks, certainly many of them are here, to if someone come to them, for them to contact our office.
Thank you, Evandro, and thank you to the superintendent. I just wanted to note of the 5 people on my staff, four women of color that are immigrants, and 3 of the 4 speak Cantonese and Mandarin fluently. If anyone needs any help at all, please let me know, and my staff and myself will be able to help with, especially with translation related issues. Would be glad to help. I also have a woman on my staff who speaks Spanish fluently, so I'm always available regardless of the time or the location. We're here to help anyone in the city. Having said that, with the city budget process coming up, I think it's important that we look at the various departments in the city to make sure that we have the necessary resources for personnel, so we can maybe hire people that do speak various languages. That's something I want to advocate. I also want to beef up the Human Rights Commission in terms of advocating for hiring a director of special investigations. That's one of my priorities. But having said that, I want to say thank you to the panelists, the Boston Police, the Attorney General's Office, the Human Rights Commission. Thank you for the incredible work that you're doing, and thank you to Council Mejia and the original co-sponsors as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Flynn, everybody needs to be put on notice that Councilor Flynn has been going hard for all things that deal with staffing and making sure that people have the funds and the capacity to really do the work, right? One thing is to propose things, and then the other is to really provide people the tools that they need to be set up for success. So I really do appreciate you, Councilor Flynn, really uplifting the importance of funding language access and translation and interpretation and some more support for the Human Rights Commission. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to Counselor Campbell. You now have the floor.
Thank you, and I'll be really brief, knowing that we are past time. So we'll follow up with questions to various departments, and I know we'll have a working session on this too. I want to thank everyone from this panel for being here, also for your patience, right? I know how busy you guys are, and you guys come to these hearings and don't get to speak until the very end. Sometimes it's not ideal, but so I really want to respect the fact that, I appreciate you guys sticking around to really share with us all the things you're doing. I want to just echo what Councillor Flynn said, looking forward to, of course, joining your efforts in some of the specific positions you're talking about. Budget cycle is coming up. We've been talking about the Human Rights Commission playing a critical role. And that's what's great about the legislation that enables the Human Rights Commission. It is broad. There is such incredible things we can do with the commission if it's resourced, if it has the human capital and everything you would need, Evandro, right, you and your team, to be able to have the greatest impact. So really looking forward to the budget hearings on that, along with, we think about civic engagement, whether that's through the Police Department Bureau, that probably needs more resources, but also how we think about supporting these organizations with grants or other types of supports from the city with no strings attached, I think is a conversation for our next budget cycle as well. And in looking forward to how we think about continuing to bring together various institutions, whether it is state organizations like the AG's office. Really appreciate you, Abby, being here. The Commission Against Discrimination, where many of our residents go, but they have usually a backlog of caseloads that is unfortunate. Community-based organizations that are serving as mediators in conflict, resolving conflicts. Clearly, there's an infrastructure that is not coordinated or connected. How do we as a city coordinate all the folks who are assisting in responding to issues of discrimination, of hate, focusing on the policy issues as well, which is, of course, as Suzanne said, a form of violence. So I'm really looking forward to just really thinking about this infrastructure that exists could be maximized and more impactful to the residents we all serve if we didn't do it in such a siloed way. So really looking forward to the next working session and diving in there as well. Thank you, Councilor Mejia, for your leadership with this committee and hearing. Not easy to do. Appreciate you and your team for coordinating dates so quickly. And thank you to Councilors Flynn and Edwards for the continued partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. Yes, a big shout out to our team, particularly Jacob de Blakecourt, who works really hard at organizing all of these hearings and making sure that we have the right people lined up to speak, as well as keeping us on time.
And central staff, sorry, Councilor Mejia. And Christine, thank you.
Yeah, I'm talking Councilor Campbell. I'm not done. I was about to also go there. I have Christine O'Donnell, who has been working really hard, as well as Ellie and your team, and Sophia and Jess, the whole 9 yards. Just really grateful for the entire crew who has made this possible. So I just really wanted to ask whether or not we had any public testimonies. Christine, in the waiting room? Yes, I think there was a Jason Lambright. So I'll let him in if he wishes to speak. Jason? And then
Hello.
Hey, Jason. You now have the floor.
Hi.
And you froze. Or I froze. I don't know. Something's happening.
I think he froze.
Yep. All this time you waited, Jason, and then you froze. So sorry.
It's unfortunate.
Back with you. Maybe you may want to restart. So while we get Jason back, I just wanted to also just share my gratitude for everyone who participated in this conversation here. This is just one of many. I am going to keep this in committee, and more importantly, I think that the dialogue, I would love to see, I always say that Boston is resource rich, but coordination poor. We have so many different departments, and I think that oftentimes we're all having our own individual conversations. So I think there is an opportunity to create space to even bring Boston Public Schools here into the fold, the Boston Public Health Commission, all of these agencies. should be leaning into this conversation as well. So my hope is that as we continue to move this dialogue forward, we think about ways that we can integrate these different departments into this dialogue. But I believe Jason is back with us. Jason, you now have the floor.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you so much for all the information that everyone took time to give out and discuss. I especially love all the information given by Suzanne and Bethany regarding how it's not just the impact of just specifically interpersonal racism that occurs between Asians and other people, but also just the general grief of like marginalized peoples just generally having issues with the systemic and also internalized racism as well. So I don't know if I'm able to ask questions, but I just wanted to point out that for me, one of the things that struck me as really home was when Bethany had discussed that when there were hate crimes or something that were occurring to Asian Americans, when they get in contact with the police, the issue that would come up is that they would come for the issue that they called for, but then sometimes would find other issues and other problems that would then lead to unseen or unforeseen circumstances that then makes the entire group of people unwary of calling or getting in contact to get help for people. And on my hand, I had not for me specifically personal, but within the neighborhood we live in Ashmont, where a situation had occurred where there was a shooting, and it was really unfortunate and terrible. And then within the same point, they had a conversation with C11 people, police officers within the Ashmont Association that basically told them that what they're going to start doing is start looking for public loitering or drinking. And then in the process, they would start arresting people on that, which again has sort of an unforeseen circumstance that came from that. And so I think that's, my main thing is just being aware of what the excuse me one second.
This is what it looks like in the times of COVID in virtual community.
Sorry about that. So that would be definitely one of the things that I wanted to discuss is just that fact that like what Boston Police Department does discuss and how they are able to resolve the issues, the unforeseen issues that come from it. So now they'd already talked to the Ashmont Association and said, oh, we already arrested somebody. When the actual issue was there was a shooting, but now they're just starting to arrest anyone. And that usually ends up being the more marginalized, more impoverished people. So I just want to say thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jason. Wondering if anyone from the administration wants to address that.
Superintendent Donovan, so I'm not quite sure which incident the gentleman's referring to, but when when an incident happens, we look at not just that in a certain area. We'll look at the particular incident and what we need to do to solve that particular crime. Sometimes that crime is a result of other activity in the area, whether it's people congregating for whatever the reason is, whether they're just hanging out and conversing, or maybe they're drinking in public at the same time. And if sometimes we have to look at those underlying issues and if they contributed to that more major incident. And if that underlying issue contributes to the major incident, i.e. the shooting, then we may look to minimize or disperse that underlying issue. It all depends. We look at we try to look at each thing individually, and come up with a plan to make the neighborhood safer. And then sometimes there's other people in the neighborhood, so the shooting sometimes will causes much greater concern in a neighborhood than drinking in public. But then yet that brings people out and realize, okay, they were kind of maybe overlooking what was a minor issue, which resulted in a more major issue. So now that minor issue that they maybe were comfortable with because it wasn't causing any problems, now they want that minor issue dealt with. So it's just something we try to look at, weigh, and then come up with, some type of balanced plan to deal with. And again, they're all individual, plans, basically, so.
Thank you for that. Really do appreciate it. Wondering if, I think we have all said our closing remarks. My internet is unstable. Luckily, I am not. So I'm going to call this hearing to a close. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Looking forward to keeping the dialogue going, and this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.